Hello, you boy in the corner there. You ought to be a Boy Scout. You're a fine-looking fella, and I know you'd make a jolly good backwoodsman by the look of you. You're ugly enough anyway. And you gal there, no, I don't mean you. I mean the pretty one behind you. You ought to be a girl guide, you know. Oh, you are one.
Last summer's Scout Jamboree in Holland, bringing together young people from 167 countries, was the legacy of one man. Baden Powell has claimed a new follower every 5 seconds for the past 90 years. Apart from the great religions and political ideologies, Scouting is the largest movement in the history of the world.
What's amazing to me is that a man who led such a admittedly bizarre life should, 50 years after his death, have ended up with a worldwide movement of 25 million people who are proud enough to call themselves Scouts.
Robert Baden Powell is one of the most famous and influential Englishmen of the century. He was blessed with an instinctive empathy for children. Through the Scouts, he gave them the chance to experience his vision of boyhood, a time of adventure, self-development, and good, clean fun. But in recent years, he's fallen from grace, castigated as a militarist, a sadist, even a fascist sympathizer. Accusations that would have startled the celebrated boy man. If only he'd had the gift of eternal youth, Baden Powell would never have needed to invent the Boy Scouts. Entranced by J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan, he saw it 3 times in its opening week. His only son, Peter, was named after it. And he wrote to one woman that his ideal partner would be
a sort of girl Peter Pan.
Scouting would become Baden Powell's way of retreating back into the world of boyhood.
The really essential meaning of Scouting to Baden Powell, it was above all things an escape. He felt deeply attracted to boyhood in a way that subsequent generations didn't. And the wonderful thing for Baden Powell and for many Scoutmasters was that through Scouting you could rediscover it and re-enter the magic world of boyhood. Baden Powell sometimes talked about himself as being a boy man, and he suggested to Scoutmasters that they'd understand boys much better if they could relearn boyhood and become boy men. It was an escape from responsibility, and it was escape from women, from having to think about his own sexuality, from everything. It was a kind of return to boyhood where he could be free of the competitiveness which his mother had forced on him, and able really to somehow rediscover what he'd lost.
In fact, Stevie, as Baden Powell was known for much of his life, never did have a happy childhood. When he was 3, his father, a clergyman and Oxford professor, died of pneumonia. His mother, Henrietta Grace, was a domineering woman with an extravagant lifestyle. Her principal aim for the children was that
they should be pleased to do my will.
She was a martinet. She was a very commanding woman. If one sees pictures of her, she is red-haired, she's big, she's buxom, and she was determined that her children would be very great within the British Empire. Financially, she managed them as any businessman would manage the business. And at the start of their careers, they actually used to sit round the dining room table and virtually put money into a central kitty on the table, and she would extract hers and then dole out the pocket money to them.
Winning his mother's love and approval meant everything to Baden Powell. When she died, he wrote in the Scout magazine,
Has it ever struck you what it means to your mother if you turn out to be a waster? She'd hoped you would make a good name for yourself, but if you do not show grit and keenness, her heart grows cold with disappointment.
At school, he was already disappointing his mother. As a pupil at Charterhouse in the 1870s, his academic record was lamentable. In his day, it was unfashionable for boys to work hard, and he was evidently a slave to fashion. A good comic actor and very gifted artist, he always preferred drawing to learning. His school reports testify to his chronic laziness.
Natural sciences pays not the slightest attention.
Mathematics has to all intents given up the study of mathematics.
I think we ought to have got to know each other
French.
quite well.
Could do well, but has become very lazy. Often sleeps in school.
Classics takes very little interest in his work.
Instead, he spent hours in the woods near the school, caught up in a fantasy world of cowboys and Indians.
I used to imagine myself as a backwoodsman and scout. I used to creep about warily, knowing that redskins were around in the shape of masters looking for boys out of bounds. I'd look for signs and get close-up observations of rabbits, squirrels, and rats. As a trapper, I set my snares, and when I caught a rabbit, I learned by painful experience to skin, clean, and cook it.
Not surprisingly, he failed to get to Oxford, where his father and two elder brothers had been. Another disappointment for Mother. Full of misgivings, he joined the Hussars, coming a shining second out of 700 applicants.
By the front! Draw! Swords! Return! Swords!
But a military career wasn't his own choice. He wanted to be an artist or actor, but Mother had insisted on the cavalry. His first posting was to Lucknow in India. He was deeply unhappy there. Though a grand city of the Raj, Lucknow was unbearably hot, rife with cholera and typhoid. His depression only lifted when he met Kenneth MacLaren, a young officer nicknamed the Boy because of his childish good looks. They became the closest of friends. Not long after they met, MacLaren's mother died.
Poor little chap. I've been trying to comfort him, but I break down more than he does almost. He's so awfully cut up.
The two men became inseparable and set up house together. Baden Powell described the boy as
my best friend in the whole world.
Male friendships were a terribly important factor in Victorian society. I mean, particularly for men who'd been educated at public schools and served in the army overseas. Prostitutes were taboo. There was no opportunity to meet members of your own nationality with the opposite sex. So Baden Powell's friendships were of vital importance, particularly his friendship with MacLaren. And this went far further than friendship. It was really a love affair. It was not a sexual love affair because he buried his sexual feelings. But, you know, they exchanged gifts. He was overjoyed on meeting him, and he kept a couple of photographs of him on his table, even at the Siege of Mafeking, years after they'd met.
the cult of manliness was common enough in Victorian England. Baden Powell's interest in masculinity went further than most. On leave from India, he stayed several times at Charterhouse with Alexander Todd, an old school friend who'd become a master there. Todd was a keen photographer, and Baden Powell was greatly impressed by his studies of scantily clad schoolboys. But he was more taken by Todd's pictures of naked boys in contrived poses, which the embarrassed school later destroyed.
Todd's photos of trees and naked boys are excellent.
He even wrote to Todd asking,
"Might I possibly get a further look at those wonderful photographs of yours?"
There's no doubt at all in my mind that Baden Powell's basic sexual orientation was what we would now call homosexual, or if one put it in psychological terms, he was a suppressed or repressed homosexual. And by that I mean he was homosexual in orientation but couldn't allow that in himself. It's well shown, I think, in his writings. For example, he loved to observe small boys in pictures or small boys undressed. He liked watching male workers who were undressed. It's clear that he was very homosexual in orientation, I think, but that doesn't mean that he was homosexual in practice. In fact, I think there's no evidence that he was.
Among the manly pursuits for officers of the Raj was hunting. But not for Baden Powell, the hunting of big game, shot from a safe distance with rifles. His game was far more dangerous. Pig sticking, hounding down wild boar at top speed, armed with no more than a spear. A champion pig sticker, he wrote a book on the sport and sketched all the illustrations.
Hog hunting is a brutal sport, yet I love it. It is invaluable to our prestige in India, proving and preserving our rightful claim to superiority as a dominant race. And I believe the boar enjoys it too.
In a letter home to his mother, Baden Powell described with glee how he speared one particular beast.
What joy to give him one and feel it going in beautifully. Now shut your ears and hold your tummy, Mummy. One spear I gave him came out through his belly and stuck into the ground. That was a pretty vicious one.
Executions were a popular spectacle a century ago. Baden Powell would seek them out on his travels. He often sketched the victims. In China, he bought an executioner's sword as a memento. He once wrote of his desperate disappointment at missing an execution. This photo is from one of his albums, where he gave it the title,
The Christmas Tree.
One important aspect of his life and his personality was that he was sadistic, in fact that he enjoyed cruelty. And so whether it was cruelty to animals in terms of pig sticking or cruelty to human beings in terms of the executions he enjoyed watching, he did enjoy those things. And the positive thing is that at least he didn't actually express his aggression in a form that would hurt other people. It was his own private expression of his aggressive impulses.
There must be something very deep in his nature that was responsible for it. I'm pretty convinced that it was his very controlling mother who absolutely outlawed any kind of bad behaviour, particularly temper tantrums. And he was denied her company a great deal in his childhood and always forced to do what she wanted. But of course you can't sort of deny your anger and bury it completely. She said he didn't cry at all as a young man. But it was going on underneath. The anger was still there, and it leaked out in, you know, his enjoyment of watching sadistic spectacles.
After 20 years in the Hussars, and with constant prodding from his mother, Baden Powell had risen steadily to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He'd become an expert in military scouting, developing new ideas on tracking, reconnaissance and camouflage. He wrote numerous books, which he rightly saw as a way of furthering his career. On completing reconnaissance and scouting, he wrote to his brother George,
"It'll be a grand advertisement for me, as I'm sending it to Wolseley and the other bosses to ask if they approve it."
Field Marshal Lord Wolseley did approve, and Baden Powell's efforts to cultivate his patronage eventually paid off. In 1899, a chance encounter with Wolseley at his London club was to change his life and fortune.
Wolseley had a knack of trying to spring surprises on you, and was all the better pleased if you were not bowled out by them. He told me, "I want you to go to South Africa. Can you go next Saturday?" Knowing well the timetable of South African steamers, I replied, "No ship on Saturday. I can go on Friday."
A year later, he would return from his mission, the most famous man in England. Baden Powell first became a household name after his legendary exploits in South Africa during the Boer War. His task was to divert as many enemy troops as possible away from the front line. Instead of fighting a guerrilla campaign in open country, he occupied the town of Mafeking and invited the Boers to attack. To that extent, the famous siege was self-imposed. Mafeking stands on the railway that Cecil Rhodes built a century ago, linking South Africa to Rhodesia. It was a vital supply line for the British forces. Surrounded by flat, dusty veldt, it was not an easy place to defend. Baden Powell ordered the land around the town to be cleared of scrub, so the enemy couldn't creep up unseen. Fortified trenches were built on the only vantage point in the area. He also indulged in boyish tricks to hoodwink the enemy.
Baden Powell employed many clever tactics to fool his enemy. One in particular was the minefield, the fake minefield. The veldt all around the town had little mines planted here and there, which were virtually boxes of sand, wires running back. One mine was a real one, had dynamite, and he exploded this as a demonstration of mines being tested. I think that kept the Boers guessing for a few days at least. In addition to that, imaginary barbed wire was strung out on poles, and soldiers were seen to be stepping over this imaginary barbed wire, giving the impression, of course, that the town was more securely defended than it really was.
Baden Powell's force of 900 men was outnumbered 7 to 1 by the Boers. To help his cause, he organised a cadet corps from among the young white boys from the town. They were his lookouts and messenger boys. He later styled them the First Boy Scouts. Several were killed by shrapnel during the siege. He also enlisted the help of the Baralong tribe, whose village bordered the town.
They would raid through the Boer lines at night in order to take cattle away from the Boers, which they would then hand over to Baden Powell for feeding, particularly to the troops. This was a very important function, but unfortunately they weren't armed and they were often shot for their pains.
Eventually the Baralong were armed, but they were then sent to the front line trenches where many more died. Baden Powell did at least request that they be awarded campaign medals. The War Office refused even that. When the war began, 2,000 members of the Shangaan tribe had sought refuge in Mafeking. It was they who were to suffer most from the siege. A journalist in the town, Emerson Neely, watched them die.
Hunger had them in its grip. Many were living corpses, their ribs breaking through their shriveled skin. The sufferers were mostly boys from 4 or 5 upwards. It was one of the most heartrending sights I have ever witnessed, and I have seen many.
Baden Powell has been blamed for deliberately starving the Shangaans in order to force them out of Mafeking and take their food for the whites.
It did enable Baden Powell to continue the siege longer, but the refugees who tried to leave the town were often shot by the Boer forces, and many had to return, preferring to take their chances in town and starve.
How many died of starvation?
Hundreds.
Baden Powell had a real problem because Kitchener ordered him in the middle of the siege to hold out for twice as long. And this really could only be done by sending certain people away, and Kitchener ordered him to do so in order to get their rations. Baden Powell didn't, in fact, stop feeding them as he'd been instructed. He instituted soup kitchens and fed them, although he did reduce their rations.
The whites suffered too, though not from starvation. 7 months of bombardment, disease and combat claimed the lives of almost 200 of the 2,000 whites in Mafeking. But Baden Powell's resolve never wavered. Throughout the siege, he led by example. A fellow officer noted his composure.
A shell whistled overhead. I hoped the colonel would take cover, but he didn't. A second shell sang a little nearer. He rose, whistling to himself, and as a third shell wrecked a couple of nearby buildings, he said, "You had better come inside."
For 7 months, Baden Powell succeeded in maintaining morale in the town by becoming the actor impresario that he had always longed to be. He opened a theatre and often played the leading role himself. There were even gymkhanas, made possible by the Boers' refusal to fight on Sundays. The British press, with no other good news to report from the war, contained daily dispatches from Mafeking. And when, after 217 days, the siege that Baden Powell had created was finally broken, the British public took to the streets.
It was absolutely sensational, and the country went mad. For 4 days, nobody worked. They had parties in the streets. The country just went absolutely bananas. And, of course, Baden Powell was the hero of the hour. And he reached a fame that probably only the monarch enjoys in this country. Everybody in the country knew about him.
The troops from the war were cheered through the streets of London too. But after near defeat by Boer farmers, the ruling classes were fearful for the future of the empire. Baden Powell echoed their concerns.
The same forces which brought about the fall of the Roman Empire are at work in Britain today.
He firmly believed that urban pollution was enfeebling British youth. He was not alone. A parliamentary committee warned,
"The deterioration of standards of physical health constitutes the gravest national peril."
Fears for national safety were not entirely unfounded. Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany, the youngest and strongest of Europe's empires, was seen as the likely aggressor who would bring war to Europe. And in war, only the fittest would survive. Could scouting save the nation? Baden Powell thought so. In an article for the Eton School magazine, he wrote,
"We are a small country, surrounded by nations who may at any time attempt to crush us. One great thing each boy can do for his country is to get together a squad of, say, 10 boys from his town or village and teach them how to shoot, how to scout, and how to drill."
Just as the Eton College article begins with the notion of England being surrounded by enemies, so the Boy Scout handbook begins with a discussion of Mafeking, which was surrounded by enemies. And it's quite clear that Baden Powell sees the metaphor of Mafeking as an indication of what England faces, that England is surrounded and is vulnerable, and the way to deal with that is to train lower-class youth to be prepared to fight for the empire. A dull lad who can obey orders, he says, is better than a bright one who can't
What one has to remember is that Baden Powell was a soldier all his working life, and so of course he wanted boys to defend Britain and the Empire if it was attacked. That was very, very important to him. But it didn't come first in his thinking about the Boy Scouts. It was his desire to make boys into better citizens that was his greatest interest. The Good Turn, for example, was all about this. And then there was the prohibition of snobbery and the idea that Scouts were brothers to every other Scout. Happiness was all important in the Scout movement. He wanted boys to be happy.
In 1907, Baden Powell, now aged 50, organised his first camping expedition to test his ideas on scouting. In May, he sailed to Brownsea Island off the Dorset coast. With him were boys from Harrow, Eton and Charterhouse, together with local lads from the Bournemouth Boys Brigade. It was a daring social mix for Edwardian England. Equally novel was Baden Powell's instruction to the Brownsea boys to wear short trousers, at that time almost unknown in Britain. The boys would learn woodcraft and tracking, but Baden Powell also aimed to teach them discipline, as he explained in a letter from the island.
There will be instruction in life-saving technique and physical exercises and drill. One wants to teach the boys the quality of not grousing, and I think that may come as a result of training like that of Scouts. For they are not born grousing. There is hope if one catches them young enough.
Position it slightly further around that's great, that'll do.
Make sure it's taut here, okay?
Scouting was really about teaching the lower class boys to accommodate themselves happily to their lot. The Brownsea experiment, the 4 patrol leaders were all public school boys. The rest of the boys were working class kids chosen from the Boys Brigade. So scouting was not an experiment to cultivate aspirations. What Baden Powell wanted was Scouts to be happy with their lot. And I think it's interesting in this regard to look at the first version of the Scout Law published in 1908, in which Scouts are asked to be loyal to king, officers, country, and employers, not parents. And the reason for not parents was not an oversight. Parents were seen, working class parents were seen as part of the problem.
Baden Powell was frankly worried by the arrival of the Labour Party. He was very worried about the formation of unions and national unity. All this was very much in his mind. But he did have a genuine love of all boys, and he was particularly keen on the idea of camping being something that would be helpful for boys who were brought up in inner cities, that they should get away to the freedom of the countryside and escape their everyday lives. And he talked about dead-end jobs and what a shame it was that people couldn't have a fair start in life. So his instincts were good ones, as well as him being controlled by, the neurosis of his class and the imperial spirit.
On his return from Brownsea, Baden Powell wrote Scouting for Boys. Published in 6 parts, it was an instant success. In 4 months, 100,000 copies were sold. It would go on to outsell all printed books, apart from the Bible, the Quran, and the thoughts of Chairman Mao. Baden Powell could have made his fortune from it, but instead donated all the profits to the Scouts.
Today, the Boy Scout Manual is the handbook for democratic youth the world over. More than 10 million copies have already been sold. It is a guide for the Boy Scout who, one night each week, assembles with his troop to reaffirm his own oath and to administer it to any new member.
On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight.
Scouting owes its appeal to Baden Powell's knack for being all things to all men. Back in 1908, the establishment applauded its military bias, the church approved of its good deeds. And Edwardian boys found the packaging irresistible.
I did try other organisations, the cadets who went around blowing bugles, and I soon got bored of that, so I chucked it up. But the Scouts gave you so much more opportunity to be yourself. It was the comradeship, and I loved hiking out in the country with my mates, camping and learning woodcraft and about nature, the wonder of nature, which I was so impressed, always have been impressed with.
Scouting was intended to make boys manly, so there was no place in it for girls. But this was the time of the suffragettes, and the girls were not going to let the boys have it all their own way. They agitated for an organisation of their own. In 1910, Baden Powell gave in, appointing his sister, Agnes, first president of the Girl Guides. But the Guides faced fierce opposition from parents, worried that their outdoor activities were not at all ladylike. To calm their nerves, Agnes warned girls against over-enthusiasm.
Violent jerks and jars can ruin a girl's interior economy and damage prospects of childbearing.
She also expressed a concern that
there are more girls nowadays with hairy lips, and I believe it due to the violent exercise they take.
Will you do your best? Answer me.
Throughout his 30 years as Chief Scout, Baden Powell issued his own warnings to the nation's boys.
And I'm coming round to look at your tents.
They must firmly resist the sexual cravings of youth, which he dismissed as
the rutting season.
A trying little interlude which boys,
if they take it calmly, will get over just as they would get over the measles.
Masturbation, he warned, was
the most dangerous of all vices. If a boy carries it on too far, he very often goes out of his mind. A very large number of the lunatics in our asylums have made themselves mad by indulging in this vice.
Scoutmasters, he said, must stamp out the evil of masturbation. He urged them
to push prudery on one side and take their boys in hand.
We all have things inside us that we don't really want to recognise, and when that happens, as it happened with Lord Baden Powell, what one tends to do is that you don't acknowledge them in yourself, but you see them in other people. So that if I'm frightened of masturbation, or I'm frightened of looking at women, or I'm frightened of a desire to smoke, I don't see it in myself, but I say, you mustn't masturbate, you mustn't be fond of women. So that a lot of his attempt to wipe all the evils that he saw them out in the world was really trying, I think, to project outwards his own feeling that those things were inside him.
By 1911, Baden Powell was father to a movement of 250,000 boys and girls. But he had no children of his own, and his mother was pestering him to get married. Sailing to America on scout business that summer, he met Olive Soames. He was 55, she 23. Strong, energetic, and with a love of the outdoors, she was an ideal match for Baden Powell. They were married the following year.
Baden Powell was really put on the spot by his mother, so you've got to get married, more or less. And so he had to find somebody who would, in a sense, suit his mother and also suit himself. And in this sense, Olive was ideal. She was boyish, she was athletic, she was, in a sense, a sort of boyish man, if you like. So that, as far as Baden Powell himself was concerned, he wasn't really marrying a woman. He was sort of marrying a young man. And as far as his attitude to his mother was concerned, who was such a dominant lady, in her eyes, I think he would feel that she wouldn't be a real woman, so she wouldn't be a competitor to his mother. So I think in these two ways, she was absolutely ideal.
Not quite ideal. When it came to consummating the marriage, Baden Powell began to suffer agonizing headaches. His doctor asked him to write down his dreams.
He wrote them down in great detail, and I have looked through them. One was that he was looking in a shop window and a man put his hand in his pocket and Baden Powell looked down at his chest and found a lump, which nowadays one would interpret as the lump of an erection, so that was a very sexual dream. The other was when he was looking for his wife, and there was a choice of 2 doors. He opened one, and it was the incorrect door, and inside that was not his wife, it was a young officer who was at the wash basin, half undressed.
And what does that indicate to you?
I think both of these indicate that there was, of course, as a woman would realize, a sexual arousal in him, as there is in everybody, and certainly that if there's a choice between male and female, as in the second dream, that he would go for the man.
Despite the headaches and the troubling dreams, Baden Powell did love his wife and succeeded in fathering 3 children. When the Great War broke out, the Scouts were prepared. They tilled the fields, took on coast-watching duties, and even emptied the rubbish. As recreation for the troops, scout huts were set up in France. Baden Powell spent several months there. But the carnage he now witnessed dulled any enthusiasm he'd once had for the glory of battle.
Today, I saw hundreds of men singing like schoolboys in their tubs. I dare say it won't be long before many of them will be festering in the fields around this very bathhouse. Somebody ought to be hanged for it.
He particularly deplored, the death of young men whom he adored. And after the war, he took any kind of militarism right out of the movement. He was determined that it should be essentially a peace movement dedicated to the ideals of international peace through young people meeting each other. And of course one has to say that there was a realistic point too in doing this, because warfare after the Great War was not very popular, and any sort of idea that young men were flocking to the colours by joining the Scouts would have been extremely unpopular.
The pursuit of international peace meant spreading the Scout gospel beyond the world of the white man. Though Baden Powell admired tribal people who lived close to nature, his racial views were often less than pure.
Baden Powell had attitudes towards blacks and towards Jews that were unattractive. Blacks were lazy and untrainable and inert and stupid. Jews were greedy and self-serving. There's a caricature that Baden Powell drew of a nouveau riche Jewish woman, a classic kind of anti-Semitic stereotype. These were not his views alone. These were views that were shared, obviously, by many people of his class. So the point is not to condemn him as a racist or an anti-Semite, but it's to understand what the package of values were that he was sharing.
In 1919, as if to mark his conversion to pacifism, the Baden Powells named their new home Pax Hill. Betty Clay, the youngest of their children, spent her childhood here.
It looks lovely, just as it did when I left it 59 years ago.
It was here that her father's headaches finally left him, when he moved his bed out of his wife's room and onto the balcony.
This has been built quite recently. This itself was the balcony. And of course it didn't have these sliding glassed-in doors. It wasn't glassed in at all. It was just open, and this was my father's bedroom. He slept out here. His bed was here, quite a small bed, and very comfortable. And because he slept here summer and winter, he had a canvas blind on a roller which he could pull down and hook onto the balustrade if the weather was really bad.
How long did he sleep here?
How long did he? All the years that I know of, right until 1938 when he left this place. Yes.
What do you think your mum thought about that?
Well, she had to accept it. That was the way he was.
Her parents' compatibility came more through scouting than sex. Olive became chief guide with a following to match her husband's.
Of course, my mother and father had the most completely wonderful partnership that one can imagine. They had almost a mother-to-child relationship because she spoilt him and he played up to this. He would pretend to cry or to sulk as though he were a naughty child, and she would chide him for it. Oh, you must do this, you must put on a woolly, darling, because I feel cold, that sort of thing, just to amuse us.
In many ways, the three children, Peter, Heather and Betty, had an idyllic childhood. And their parents were keen they shouldn't grow up too quickly.
I was friends with Lady Baden Powell's nieces, who she brought up, and they used to invite me to stay. And we used to arrive at whatever the station was, I've forgotten. And the chauffeur would say, we've still got nail varnish on, and lend us a penknife to scrape it off, because Lady Baden Powell wouldn't allow any makeup. We didn't wear lipstick or powder or anything. She liked healthy, shiny faces. In fact, I remember when I was about 30, I met her in the war, and she shouted across the theatre at me, Mary, you're wearing lipstick. And I was then a grown woman with a couple of children, and she still objected.
Their son Peter bore the brunt of his parents' puritanical attitudes.
On one occasion, I was in a double bed in the spare room, and both the Baden Powell girls came in, and Peter, who was very young, very spotty, and he'd just got into the bed beside me, and was sitting about a yard away from me in this double bed. And we were talking, and we were perfectly happy, when the door suddenly flew open, and in came Olive, and shouted at him, Peter, what are you doing there? And the poor boy shot out of my bed and out of the room, and we all looked at each other in amazement. We couldn't think what she was on about, because we were all extremely innocent. And of course she was concerned about sex, and that Peter, I don't know what Peter was supposed to be doing to me in front of an audience of his two sisters and two cousins. However, she still chased him out of the room, and he scurried off like a terrified rabbit.
The rules of the house may have been strict, but Betty's memories are of a doting father.
I remember him as a most marvellous dad. I can't imagine anybody being a better father than ours was. He was always interested in what we did. He was always encouraging. I think that was the thing I remember most about him, was that he was an encourager. Whatever we did, however we did it, if it wasn't up to standard, he said, well, you know, I think you could do better than that.
For Peter, the son and heir, encouragement turned to expectation. He was groomed to emulate his father and become chief scout in his turn. It was more than the boy could manage.
Over the pressures that we all three had, I suppose, because of our parents being in the public eye like that, I suppose it was difficult. I think my brother felt it, my brother Peter felt it most, because of course they felt their only son must be rather extra special, and he was a particularly normal, ordinary chap.
I'm afraid the expectations were more than he could bear. My grandparents really did wish to have a mirror image of my grandfather, which is plainly impossible. My father was a very sickly child. He actually had a very happy childhood, but he had pressures applied to him by his parents, particularly his mother, which were beyond his capabilities. My father was so terrified of her that as an adult, he loathed ever going to see her, and it was very much a duty visit to see her. And I do remember him on occasion actually wetting his pants. This is a mature man wetting his pants, going to see his mother. That is the fear that she put into her son, because as far as she was concerned, he was a failure.
11,000 scouts in this Jamboree camp will be reviewed by the chief.
It was hard to be anything but a failure compared to his father. By 1931, there were 3 million Boy Scouts, to whom Baden Powell, now dubbed Chief Scout of the World, was a superstar.
Let us then, with pride, repeat the Scout promise. On my honor, I promise I will do my best to do my duty to God and the King.
In his desire to make scouting the spearhead for world peace, Baden Powell even sought to embrace the Hitler Youth. Though critical of Hitler himself and his creed of racial purity, he did admire elements of the Führer's philosophy.
Lay up all day reading Mein Kampf, a wonderful book with good ideas on education, health, propaganda and organisation.
In his naivety, he was still arguing in 1937 for British Scouts to fraternise with the Hitler Youth, though he changed his mind well before war broke out.
Long after Scout commissioners and advisors were trying to break connections, he was trying to keep them. He was moved by the fact that the Hitler Youth, clearly in some ways based on his own principles. I think he saw the Hitler Youth as an organization attempting to do what he was attempting to do, that is to train boys to be obedient and to accept the authorities from above. He found, I think he was reluctant to break relationships with an organization which he felt shared the same kinds of values that he shared in terms of obedience and cleanliness and an ordered existence and support of the government.
By the time war broke out, the aging boy man had left Pax Hill to settle in Kenya. He was now in his 80s. To the end, he retained the power to captivate children.
When I was about 3 years old, my family went up to Kenya to stay with him. Now, as a child, I was very curious, and I always wanted to know answers to my questions, and nobody would ever give them. But for the first time in my life, I met somebody who would not only answer the questions, but expand on it, so that it really gave me an overall picture. And of course, that was the old man. And because of that, I absolutely adored him.
It was in the Africa that he knew and loved so well that Lord Baden Powell was laid to rest. Near his home at Nyeri in Kenya, the coffin was borne with full honors to the cemetery, and final tributes were paid to that great man, the Chief Scout. As a soldier, his fame was great, and as the founder of the finest youth movement ever organized, he will be remembered by generations to come.
It's interesting how he did channel two important aspects of himself into the Boy Scouts. One was his homosexuality. That was a very positive achievement, and he allowed boys of all sorts of backgrounds and economic difficulties and things to have a good life. The second thing I think he channeled into the Scouts was his Peter Pan complex. He was absolutely preoccupied with being a child and never growing up. And I think that by concentrating on boys, small boys, he in some way allowed his own identification with them to remain permanent. He was always a small boy indulging in small boys' games.